This is a journey, and it starts with a lot of learning and storytelling. And I am so excited to invite two just absolutely amazing women to kick off our panel on race, gender, and success. The first is Pattie Sellers, who is an award-winning journalist, writer with 30 years at Fortune. But it's not just her writing, it's also her leadership. She was one of the co-founders of the Most Powerful Women list and community, which has just been so incredible in helping advance equity and inclusion for women across the globe. It's not just a US organization, it's global. And after 30 incredible years, she went out as an entrepreneur with Nina Easton to create SellersEaston, which is an agency that works with corporations and nonprofits really around storytelling, especially around social issues, and just have had an incredible success and lots of impact if you've seen any of those. So very excited to welcome Pattie. And then secondly, Karen Boykin-Towns, who is just a visionary and such a results-driven leader. I got to know Karen years ago at Pfizer, where she was one of the key leaders in our government affairs and public affairs, and then was named the first ever Chief Diversity Officer for Pfizer. She had a phenomenal career at Pfizer and recently retired about 2 years ago to start her own consulting firm, really focused on public affairs issues, especially around race and diversity. All that, plus she's also the vice chairman of the NAACP in the United States, which has just been an incredible experience. But I'm also really grateful for her friendship and for her counsel over the last few months as I began my learning journey. And I thought those two amazing women would be a great way to sort of begin our own discussion on some of these issues. And given she's just one of the most phenomenal interviewers ever, I will turn it over to Pattie to kick off the panel.
Thank you, Kristin, so much. And it's so funny. I love that you opened this with storytelling. Cheers to that. It's a delight to be here. And I really am waving the flag for Zoetis as it goes on this D&I journey. And it's so interesting to me that you are a company that is less than 8 years old. And Kristin, you're a new Fortune 500 CEO. And boy, 2020 is the year of opportunity to chart this path in a very big way. I'd like to start with Karen. And Karen, you had a long career at Pfizer, as Kristin said, and spent part of that, a piece of that as Chief Diversity Officer. Tell us what has been the sort of key lesson as you've navigated to leadership positions, and now as you sort of bring this mindset to a company like Zoetis in helping them clear the way for other talented, diverse people to move into leadership positions.
It's so great to be with you, and as a Zoetis shareholder, I could not be prouder of the work that you guys are doing in such a short period of time to really address this important issue. And as Kristin said, we've known each other for quite some time, and to get the call from her, Roxanne, Sherry, and Wayma in June to talk about this really meant a lot, because I know of the commitment that she has. I think in my experiences, companies that are new to this, whether because, of the times that we find ourselves, it's really one where they are trying to figure out how to do it. We've had social statements, we've had donations, but it's really now about how to make those opportunities. And with what we saw from Evelyn's presentation, it really goes to show you're doing the key points. You've acknowledged that there's a need to address the issue. You've identified ways in which to sort of bring external experts in to sort of help with your diversity pipeline. You've identified benefit opportunities to kind of address the issues. And what I would say in all the companies that I've been working with, Zoetis is really on the forefront of how it is addressing the issues. It's being transparent. in terms of what its diversity data is. It is putting out for the public to see what its aspirations are. And quite frankly, it is doing something that a lot of CEOs have kind of backed away from, and it's addressing race-based opportunities. So if Blacks is an area that you're trying to accelerate their development, to really have programs that are focused there is really important. And so it's really great to see how you guys are on the forefront, even though you're just at the beginning of your journey. So congratulations.
Kristin, I would like to ask you're a white woman in corporate America. Granted, there's bias. I mean, I've spoken for over 2 decades about women and power, and there is no question that women are judged by a narrower band of acceptable behavior than men tend to be. And of course, for people of color and women of color, that then we're talking about a different and probably even narrower band. Tell us about your journey, and I would love for you to sort of tell the group, tell this group, what has been an obstacle or a challenge for you over your decades, and how that has influenced the way you're thinking about leading now on the diversity and inclusion front.
Wow. Well, this may sound a little strange, but I remember early in my career, I was attending a session. I was probably, young 30s, and it was a diversity event, and, it was looking at the glass ceiling. And I thought, it's not a problem in my generation. We're fine if you just work really hard and you do a good job. It's all merit-based. And I think early in my career, that was true. If you look at most companies' pipelines, they're pretty rich and, diverse at the very low level for women. Certainly not for other groups. But as I moved on in my career, I started seeing that the behaviors that were going to be acceptable and how I was being perceived changed. And I started to understand what people were talking about. And I'll be more specific. I think colleagues around the world probably know I'm a pretty passionate person. Passion from a woman is perceived differently oftentimes than passion from a man. Whereas I might feel I'm being passionate and maybe assertive, I'm perceived sometimes to be aggressive. So much so that early in my career, in my 30s, I was advised to never wear the color red, because red on me was going to come across as too aggressive, and I should try pastel colors because it would soften me. And, I think no matter who you talk to around the world, given different races or cultures you're from, you hear things for whatever the stereotype is. But it started making me realize that, bringing my full self to work was hard at a certain level. And I felt like I had to try to be somebody else. And it's really hard to be someone other than yourself. I have to say, I was super grateful to find sponsors and mentors who believed in me, who were excited about who I was and fought for me. But it is a journey. And I think it made me realize throughout that everyone was slightly different. Believe it or not, parenting has taught me a lot. I have an extremely introverted daughter, and she needs time to process. And so whereas I'm really quick, I've started to learn if I want her best ideas, they're not going to be in the moment. They're going to let her think through it and come back to her. And so when we think about inclusiveness, as a leader, as a CEO coming into this, I do think about it very broadly, and the recognition that I don't know what someone's style is or what their background is, and to be a little more open, to seek to understand the different perspectives. So I would say I've been on my own journey, and certainly in the last 6 months, a realization that what I thought I knew, I really didn't know, and needed to spend a lot more time. So I would say there was my journey until the last 6 months. And then I feel like a little bit, I've been in a really crash course just about what that means to understand the history and the biases that we don't intend, but we bring to many conversations.
Are you wearing red?
I am not wearing red. I should have worn red today. That's what I should have done. I should have worn red. That was it. Oh, well.
No, but in general, are you
Yes.
avoiding red or wearing red?
No, I mean, I think I've came to the conclusion I'm here now. I don't think, I'll be honest. I wish I could say that in the last few years, I didn't cross my mind. I was, I felt like being more neutral, I felt like was easier as a woman, less looking at it. And I I do feel differently now. I feel like I can be more myself. And that just says something that even as senior as I was, that I still, to be very honest, did avoid it. I wish I could claim I didn't, but the honest answer is I don't think most people have probably ever seen me in red at work. I have lots of it in my personal life, but.
Fascinating. So tell us, so Kristin, you came in January, or you not came in, you were promoted in January to CEO before the world changed. Actually, COVID was around, right? But we didn't know the world had changed in January. So as you were coming into this job, Kristin, and thinking about the kind of company and the kind of culture you wanted to build, what were you thinking then? And how have the events, COVID and all the stuff that has happened around racial justice this year, how has that changed or accelerated your decision-making and your execution?
Yeah, the pandemic wasn't on my 100-day plan, as you might have imagined. So, when we kicked it off as an executive team, we were really fortunate. We have an incredibly strong culture, incredibly strong engagement. I would actually say that has a lot to do with why we've been so successful over the last 7 to 8 years. So the good news was I was starting with a great base, and interestingly, starting with one of the most diverse leadership teams and boards, in the S&P 500. But we hadn't really thought about diversity throughout the organization or had a plan. And we put that on our list of the key things we were going to do. Then the pandemic hit, and that kind of got a little bit slowed down. We focused a little bit more on making sure we could ship to customers, really focus on the health and well-being of our colleagues, and what that looked like, which ended up really bringing some of these diversity issues to bear. So you think about inclusion for working parents, immune compromised people, people who had to go into sites versus didn't. You started really thinking about the disparities. Interestingly, but we were really focused on health and safety of colleagues and the diversity stuff was there, but it wasn't really as accelerated. And then when May came, it was personally devastating, as I'm sure it was for many people around the world who watched. And we thought a lot what we could do differently. And we definitely accelerated our efforts in this space. We had been focusing on some of the equity of opportunity issues through COVID as a leadership team across the world, because it really did affect different populations very differently. And so we were acutely aware of that, but it really just started as an executive team, a very different journey. And for me as a leader, of how we were going to think about it. And first it was certainly bringing on Karen, having us read White Fragility as a leadership team and really start that dialogue as a team of what that looked like. And I think we then really made sure that we brought in key leaders such as Evelyn, and it's been accelerated. It was always on our agenda. I think the realization of how important it was to our success as a company, and that maybe we weren't doing as well as we thought we were as a company, is the honest answer. I think we thought, this is nice, we'll work on it, it'll be okay. You start realizing when you really ask the questions to seek to understand that there was a greater opportunity for us, I think.
Karen, was that your recommendation for the management team to read White Fragility?
Yes, but the good news was, though, that in all honesty, Kristin had already started reading books and watching movies and that sort of thing. And, thinking back then, there was a lot of pain and angst and anguish, quite frankly. And what I really respected of her was the fact that she wasn't necessarily just looking to Black people to really kind of help her understand, but she was willing to do the work herself to really try and get those understandings and come to the conversation, already sort of have done some of the work.
Yeah. What else, Karen, I know this is one big collaboration between you and Kristin and the management team and a lot of other people, but I'm curious, as an expert in this space, what other perspectives, guidance you brought to the party? Now, don't be a girl and be afraid to boast.
Well, when I was appointed Chief Diversity Officer at Pfizer, believe it or not, it was Kristin, who was the head of strategy at that time, who I went to really kind of help to devise a global strategy. So she came to the party already with a lot of the, tools and whatnot. What I would say is that reminders such as, not picking the same people all the time for special projects, right? We have our go-to people, those people who we can count on, who we know will deliver each and every time for us. But what we know is that does not always allow for opportunity. It does not always allow for an inclusive environment. So, a reminder to kind of reach out a bit more broadly when, having to staff that task force or that special team, and not making assumptions, right? I can remember so many times, people making assumptions without talking to me, and that kind of would, limit opportunity, or you have to fight even harder to kind of break down those assumptions. But I think it's sometimes the small things that we need to pay attention to, because frankly, to recruit people of color can be easier than keeping them. And so we have to remember that we don't want to just onboard them. When we onboard them, we want to have an environment where they can thrive and feel like they can, thrive and be their best selves.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So as you're building this D&I strategy, and you are setting targets, you've done that. You have very specific targets for, what is it, 2025, I believe. You publish your numbers. Sunlight is the best disinfectant, right? What have you, so we have a sense of what you've chosen to do. Is there anything that you've chosen not to do that you thought, we could do this, but no, we're going to do something else?
Sure. I mean, I think for starters, as we look at this as an issue, as a global issue, it's the realization that the definition of diversity and equity is very relevant to the specific market. And I think one of the approaches we've had as a team is to say, empower our local leaders. Let's be clear on the values as a company that we have and what we mean by inclusion, as I think Evelyn went through, but to empower our local leaders to set objectives that were relevant for their population and given the challenges that they have. We're a global company who has a direct field force in 45 markets around the world. And so one of them that was hard was a desire to just say, these are the absolutes and this is global, without the realization of understanding what was really different. I think what we're trying to do is really work with each market around the world to understand what this means for them, what the unique challenges and populations, because it may be, Blacks in the United States, but there's many economically underserved communities. If you want to look at Brazil, I know we have Simone on today's call, and what was interesting when we started doing our work is I received a lot of notes from people around the world in how they felt about this, what it meant to them. And I think one of the decisions of what not to do was not to try to put a peanut butter smear across the world. It was to say for each market, what does this mean? And then hold them accountable. So it'll be in everyone's objectives for next year to understand. And it's going to be different in different people's objectives and markets. If you're in Japan, we were quite focused with a virtual town hall, recently around the issue of women. And really what holds women back there is actually a little different. There are more fundamental structural issues that we need to deal with. So I think a lot of what it was, it's hard as a leader you want to just put absolutes out and tell everyone to go do it. But it was really seeking to understand what our local markets were facing and what that would mean for them. I would say was one of the things we, as much as I wanted to put a global thing out, it was really understanding what was relevant for everyone.
Karen, you now have a company that advises other companies besides Zoetis. What have you found are the mistakes that companies tend to make as they build a D&I strategy and execute it, or the sort of assumptions that they may have that are actually incorrect and we all should watch out for?
Well, I think some of the mistakes are when you're outspoken externally, but you're not doing the work internally in which to sort of make the changes. We've seen companies that have been a bit more forward leaning, and then you've heard from their employees about how it's not getting addressed in-house, right? So that's definitely, not a to-do. I think the other thing, quite frankly, is not doing anything because you're busy wrangling your hands and not wanting to be embarrassed or make a mistake. But the point of the matter is, more times than not, you have a good sense on which companies are, either doing the work or that they have sort of, just because you don't put your numbers out there doesn't mean that people don't have a good sense as to whether you have diversity or not. Transparency really is the way, and 25 of the top 100 companies thus far have been transparent and put their EEO1 information out for everyone to see. I think we're going to see more of that, but ultimately, they're trying. And, I think people want a little less talk, a lot more action. And I think that's really where people are really trying to get to in the right way.
So all of the people who are in this summit and watching and thinking about what they can do, what is your advice to them as they try and do what they can do to help Zoetis become one of the really top companies in terms of diversity and inclusion?
Yeah, so Evelyn used the 4 C's that Zoetis has come forward with: culture, colleagues, career, and community. I like to talk about the 3 C's: courage, commitment, and conviction. And so what we know is that this is a window of opportunity where people are listening, where leaders are listening, where leaders are open. And it's really important, no matter where you sit within the organization, to use your voice. Use your voice to speak up, because you're in a company that is really wanting to do right and build this amazing culture of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And they don't have all the answers. And if everyone sort of pitches in and give their input, I think it really will help with the acceleration that you're going on. And you will not just have one of the best leaders at the helm of your company, but really a company that can be a leader in this space as well.
Kristin, boss?
I first of all, obviously, I agree with everything that Karen said. I think, for some of us, I think it also is, just really focusing when you're walking to a meeting to seek to understand first, before we judge. It's very quick, and to ask why and how and questions versus quickly coming up with statements. I think the more I've gone on my own journey, there's a lot of assumptions that we all have in our head and that we walk into a room with when we see or when we hear somebody. And I think building this inclusive culture that we're talking about globally starts with courage to speak up and courage to listen without judgment, seeking when someone says something that feels very different or uncomfortable, to lean into that discomfort to understand it versus quickly write it off. It's certainly been, if you ask me, the biggest challenge for me over the last months is really staying in that uncomfortable space sometimes to really continue to understand something and ask more questions about it before we're quick to judge it. At least I feel like if we're going to get to the aspiration that we want, which is that every one of our colleagues come to work and feels valued for their contributions and feels that they can be successful, it starts with hearing them. And that starts with really seeking to understand.
I'm going to call you on this. When did you, in your sort of listening and learning journey, when did you feel uncomfortable?
Well, I will say, as Karen said, I was watching a bunch of things, but, before I spoke to Karen, I will say, a good friend of mine, Tashonda Duckett, we're kids are friends, put a challenge to me when this whole thing started. She sent a text to a few of us and she just laid it out that.
Tell the group who Tashonda is.
So Tashonda Duckett runs Chase Bank globally, which is probably one of the largest, consumer banks in the world. And she's African-American, for those who don't know her. And she sent a note to a few of her friends that were white. And she said, "My white friends." And she said it that way, which already, by the way, made me uncomfortable, because I don't think of myself that way. And she said, if you're really going to be a partner, you need to understand, and you don't. which I felt like I thought I was someone who valued diversity and inclusion. And so it was very uncomfortable. And she said, you need to watch this PBS series. And I'm willing to talk to anyone once they've all watched it. But until you've watched it, keep it to yourself. And it was uncomfortable. I mean, as someone who's a personal friend, to put it out there in that very direct way. But it was a learning for me because I did think about it differently after spending 6 hours that my husband and I sat down and watched it that weekend. And it started this, I need to be more uncomfortable. I don't know what I think I know. It was upsetting. I mean, I will tell you, but it was important. That's why I say I thought I knew certain things. And then I realized it wasn't really what I knew.
So what is the PBS series?
It's around, the post-Civil War Reconstruction and what it really wasn't. I mean, the assumptions of what we were building as a country wasn't, and it really talks and goes into depth around many of the sort of systemic racism that's and what the roots of it were, in how we set up our politics, how we set up our government, how we set up who could serve, how we kept people from their ability for economic prosperity. So it looks at both the economics as well as the political. And it really was it was harder to believe some of the things you thought were fair that really weren't fair at all. And how deeply that was not fair. Back to the end of the Civil War, which arguably we had a more diverse Senate and Congress directly following the Civil War than we have ever since, which is very hard for some people. So they've made a lot of progress and it all went backwards. And the psychological impact of that.
Was this Ken Burns's Civil War series on PBS? Because I think I would like see this, and I think
I'll send you the link. I don't know if it was Ken Burns, but it was. Yeah. I think it's important. Everyone has their own journey around the world. We have colleagues of understanding the history of a country. And by the way, the reason this is probably more disturbing for me is I was a history major, so I thought I knew.
Right?
And what I realized is they didn't teach any of this in the history books that I read. None of this was covered. And so it was really, again, as a history major, I thought I knew and I didn't. And I think being humble is important for people to realize you may know a lot, but you probably don't know all that. History is told by who writes it, and who wrote it, weren't that diverse set of people.
Yeah. Karen, what's your perspective on this? And I'm curious, after you have sort of, this has been, if not front and center for you your entire life. I mean, you had a lot of jobs at Pfizer, a lot of senior jobs that were outside the diversity space. But I'm sure you've thought about this issue for much of your life. What have you learned this year as the sort of tide has turned around this issue of race and equality?
Pattie, so much. But to get to piggyback on what Kristin said, the whole anti-racist movement that we are in is one that is very uncomfortable. I have the privilege of working with a few universities, and across the country, you see young people going to administrations and telling them the changes that they want. And, a lot of it goes into, curricula, right? And as a Black person growing up, nowhere in through graduate school, never was I taught by a person of color, one, and two, the history that we're now learning about with the 1619 project that came out last year from the New York Times, really sort of tells it in a way that most people have not been taught. And so as we're going through these discussions, you're dealing with, things and truths that people had for which they're now being challenged. And you have those that are open, you have those that are very defensive and they want to push back on it. And so I think one of the things that I've learned during this time is to try and recognize that it is through candid conversations, small group discussions, for which you can create that sort of safe space where friends who know each other and respect each other can have these sort of uncomfortable conversations where there is the learning that can happen. Now, I think, in June, I was like flat out tired because, besides just my own journey, but also doing the work, it was a lot. But I felt it was like an obligation that I had to try and advance the conversations that were needed because, this window of opportunity is going to close at some point. And so we have to lean in and try and ensure that there's understanding because I don't know that most people, kind of wake up and say, I am going to, treat someone badly, or I'm going to try and make someone feel as though they're not included. I don't think that most people, are wired that way. There are some, but I think most people are probably not that way. And so if that's the case, then how do we extend grace? How do we extend grace to people who ask the question, not quite sure how to say it? And many times managers don't want to touch this because they don't want to say that wrong thing that gets them canceled. We're in this whole cancel culture right now. And so people want to know, but they don't exactly know how to approach it. And so if we can find ways to have these conversations, I think it does us all good, and they're very much needed.
I love that, finding grace and the cancel culture. I mean, going back to the beginning of the Me Too movement, it was, managers, bosses, male bosses were left with fear about engaging too sort of intimately on this issue. And yes, Karen, we are dealing with this now as the focus in 2020, at least, is very much on race. So how do you step forward and speak up? I think you both said that it begins with listening and learning. And before we wrap up, I'd love to hear from each of you what you mentioned, white fragility. If there's anything you want to say about what you learned from that book, I think we'd be interested. I am curious what other books you have read that have been helpful and maybe other people would find helpful.
Karen, you want to start?
Sure. I think there are a few, Dear White People was one. I think Just Mercy was another one, which if you don't want to read the book, there's a movie version of it, and a talk which I'm actually giving with the Ridgefield Playhouse tomorrow on it. But I think, and so you want to talk about race is another, but I think that, there's a lot to read for sure. But I think that at the end of the day, I think looking introspectively within ourselves to understand, how did I, how many white friends do I have in my network? How many Black friends do I have in my network? Just some of those practical things where we can kind of get out of the bubbles in which we live, whether we live physically or within our social constructs that we have, to really extend it, to say, I want to expand. I want to have others kind of in my orbit so that I can learn, I can give, we can all grow. I think that's really a practical way. And something that my kids were just like, well, Mom, Dad, how many white friends do you really have? They went to boarding school, so they have, and I was like I have friends. What are you talking? But then when you think, who do you go on vacation with? Who do you dine with when it's not a business sort of engagement? I mean, I think we all have an opportunity to really have some self-reflection and extend ourselves a bit, because the only way we're going to get better is by doing that.
Great advice. Kristin.
I think that it was so important. I think that her point on what is your, what are your last, 100 calls to your friends, and how many of those were diverse? I mean, it is, what's in your Rolodex? Who do you spend your time with? And a book, I mean, I agree with, I've read many of the books that Karen was just a bunch of those that are great. But a book that you might not think about that really teaches you about the echo chambers you live in is a book called Radical Inclusion. And the argument is that it's sometimes, building a broader network and getting your idea out and listening to the far edges of an organization for business success. It's written by the previous head of the Joint Chiefs for the White House. We live in echo chambers. And so I started thinking about, who am I listening to on my social media? Who am I following on LinkedIn? Who am I following on Twitter? What are the voices that I hear? And that once you decide, even in our profession, as you look at the veterinarians that you follow and that are saying things, who are you following and who are you listening to? And do they look like you? Do they sound like you? And lean into some discomfort. Hear radically different perspectives. We're going to be better leaders if we understand the broader issues around us. So I do think a lot of it is around reading books, but I actually will challenge you. A lot of people are busy here in the current environment in the world where work-life balance is really hard. This can be done in just really simple ways of choosing to have a more diverse set of people that you hear. Journalists, do you know the journalists who are writing those articles and what they look like, and what their educational background is, or what countries they are from? So I do think there's little ways, not just the big books and big, you have 6 hours to kill in a weekend to watch a miniseries. You can just change that every day by who you choose to listen to in your social media or in your news feeds.
Yeah.
Great advice. I am championing everything you're doing and admiring it. And I wish you luck as you continue on this journey. And I really appreciate your inviting me to be part of your D&I Summit. And thank you, Karen. And thank you, Kristin.
Thanks so much.